For what purpose is Senator from Eastern Fairfax, Senator Serville, rise?
Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, this legislation, when originally passed, was about chasing ghosts from my point of view. You know, when people want to commit election fraud, they don't do it one vote at a time. They do it as a big group. And the idea that somebody's going to go and fake somebody's ID just to vote is nonsensical. But beyond all that, the reason that this legislation...
I had asked if the senator would yield.
I'll yield.
Will Senator yield?
Mr. President, I would ask whether the senator is familiar with a case just, 10, 15 years ago, I guess it was a little longer than that because it was before I was in the Senate, in which a member of the Senate of Virginia was caught and charged with voting for somebody else.
Senator has the floor.
I'm not familiar with him, but I hope he went to jail and isn't part of this body anymore.
Is not a member of this body, but I would point out to the gentleman that his claim that it never happens is belied by the truth.
Okay, well, I hope he didn't cast a vote in the Yancey race a couple years ago. But in any event, listen, the reason this legislation doesn't, or the existing system doesn't work, is because not everybody has a license or access to photo ID. All right, I emailed the Commissioner of the Department of Motor Vehicles this morning, and I asked him how many people today are suspended in Virginia. But thanks to Senator Stanley's work and the governor's work, that number is thankfully down. The last time I asked, it was over 800,000. Today, it's down to 333,820 people whose licenses are suspended. What happens when your license is suspended? If you happen to run into a police officer, they take it. What happens in the building that I go to work in every day when I'm at home? I see about 100, 200 licenses trading hands from people to the government every day. And if you're one of those lucky people that happens to be in court within a week or two or three of when you have to vote, you're not going to have your government ID because somebody's going to be holding it for you. And the idea that somebody's going to go get an ID just so they can vote isn't really realistic. And so a lot of those people don't have their ID because they either got suspended, they broke the law, I get it. But just because you got a reckless driving ticket and had your license taken by a judge doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to vote. Secondly, there's 28 nuns in my district. They live in this monastery up on a hill. They don't even wear shoes every day. And I guarantee you they don't have photo ID because they just don't drive. They've taken a vow of poverty. You want to disenfranchise nuns? Vote red. Let me tell you two other stories. Back when I ran the first time in 2009, I was knocking doors. I ran into this woman named Mildred Downing. Mildred was 96 years old. And she told me she'd vote for me. And I asked her if she needed a ride to the polls. And she's like, no, I don't need a ride. I was out there working outside Stratford Precinct, shaking hands. Car pulls up. Mildred gets out of the car with her walker and walks up to me and says, I told you I'd vote, and I'm here. You know what? Mildred didn't have a driver's license, I'm pretty sure, because she's 96 years old. I don't know many 96-year-olds that have a driver's license as much as anybody that lets them keep them. In that same election, number 4, I was knocking doors right next to my high school, West Potomac High School. And I was looking at my voter file. I was talking to this man. He was 83 years old. I was having a conversation with him. He committed to vote for me. And I looked at the sheet. And it said on my sheet, I looked at him and I said, my voter sheet here says that there's a person in this house who's 105 years old. He's like, oh, that's my mom, Maddie Lou. She's sitting right there. And there was a woman sitting in this chair, 105 years old, Maddie Lou Ware. And I asked her if I could have her vote. She nodded and said, yeah. And it turned out that she had registered to vote because she wanted to vote for President Obama. She'd gotten out of the house, gotten down to register, and made the effort to vote. But I guarantee you this 105-year-old woman did not have a driver's license and probably didn't have photo ID. So, there it is. If you want to disenfranchise people that just have the bad luck to go to court, you want to disenfranchise nuns, you want to disenfranchise 90-year-olds, 100-year-olds, vote red, be my guest. But this bill will allow everybody in Virginia to vote because if you're a citizen, you make it to 100 years old, you ought to be able to vote. And I think we ought to vote this through.
For what purpose is Senator from Western Fairfax, Senator Marsden, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak briefly to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
If my memory serves me correctly, and maybe it doesn't, but I remember Governor McDonnell spending $3.5 million sending out voter ID cards to everybody, and then we turned around and did voter photo ID. So I guess whatever purpose he had in mind didn't work out, and we had to turn around and do something else. But I guess we wasted $3.5 million to do that, and that's kind of curious, Mr. President. Thank you.
For what purpose does senior senator from Fairfax, Senator Saslaw, rise?
Speak briefly to the bill.
Senator, has the floor.
I suspect I've been through a lot more elections than anybody here in this room, but there was never, until this was passed, 2012, there were never any allegations that I can remember ever in any of the newspapers about voter fraud. It was simply not needed. And, simply because one Republican state senator in the 90s decided to go vote for somebody else, don't blame all of society on that. We need to take this off the books. We didn't need it then. We don't need it now.
Any other senators wish to be heard regarding Senate Bill 65? Senator from Hampton, Senator Locke. For what purpose, Senator from Rockingham, Senator Obenshain, rise.
I'm happy to yield, but I thought maybe the gentlelady from Hampton would like to close. I understand.
Okay, she will close. You have the floor.
Just point out a couple of things. Number one, it was a Democratic state senator. It was not. And I'm glad he's not alive to hear that, because that would maybe be defamatory, but I don't know. Second of all, I'm not worried about the 95-year-old nuns. I don't know. But it just seems to me that, as I recall, we just passed anytime absentee voting. And there is no impediment to anybody casting a vote by absentee, should they wish to do so, should they have no photo identification. And I further don't know about what the senior senator from Fairfax, his daily reading is, but every newspaper I read had articles over the course of the past decade about voter fraud and about photo identification. There was difference of opinion, but don't let anybody kid you that there was never any example of voter fraud by individuals showing up and fraudulently casting their votes. This was a common sense measure, and notwithstanding the theoretical, hypothetical examples that were given, fact remains that to this day, I haven't heard on the floor, or I haven't heard through the newspapers, I didn't hear through the federal litigation of one single person who was denied the right to vote as a consequence of this common sense legislation. Please vote no.
What purpose, Senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak to the bill.
Senator, has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm listening to this conversation, and of course, part of these bills, I was here in 2012 when it was passed, but part of these bills always seems to involve voter suppression, and you're keeping people from having the ability to vote. And so I looked up at the turnouts that we had, and even the number of registered voters in Virginia. When this bill passed in 2012, we had 5.4 million voters. And that election, which elected Barack Obama, was 3.8 million. Move forward to 2016, we had increased our numbers in registered voters by over 100,000 to 5.5 million. Actually, it was an increase of 6.4%, and the votes were 120,000 more than they were 4 years before in a presidential election. 72% turnout. And then I'm looking at even 2017, 2018. Now we have, at least in 2018, 2019, 5.7 million registered voters in Virginia. In 2018, 3.3 million in an off-year election, 59% voted. Now think of it this way. If voter ID was so bad, Mr. President, where's the voter suppression? Why aren't the turnouts lower? How are we having something that protects us from voter fraud turning out to be so bad when we're seeing more people register and more people going to the polls? Some things just work. And when they work, we let them alone. You and I all go to the polls every year. And you walk in and you give them your ID and they scan the back of it. Not only is it the right thing to do to protect our elections, but also it's highly efficient for our registrars and for the State Board of Elections to keep this kind of data that I just read to you. But I don't see less people voting. I don't see any change in the absentee numbers. In fact, those have gone up. In fact, I don't even see the provisional numbers changing. So why change this law? It's a good law. Let's leave it be. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose, Senator from Arlington, Senator Favola, rise?
I'm speaking to the bill, Mr.
Senator,
President.
the floor.
Well, I just want to note, and I do respect the senator from Franklin County, but we don't know how many people actually never showed up at the polls because of the requirement for this photo ID. I mean, we should be as welcoming as possible when we're talking about holding elections. Overall, the United States has the lowest voter turnout of all the industrialized countries in the world. We just don't vote here. And we need to pass policies that encourage more voting. Institutions of higher learning have studied voter fraud. The Brennan Institute of Justice, I think it's associated with NYU, studied voter fraud. And it was less than 0.3%. The current law passed, and it was a solution looking for a problem. It is high time that we overturn the law and pass the proposal before us that Senator Locke has put forward in a thoughtful way. I think it's time, and I ask the body to pass this bill. Thank you.
For what purposes the junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Kiggins, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm relatively new here, so maybe I just didn't catch some of the obvious things. But I use my photo ID multiple times a day. I use it frequently when I'm using my credit card, if I have to buy alcohol, cigarettes, open a bank account, even apply for things like food stamps, welfare, Medicaid. So if you don't have an ID card, there are ways to get ID cards that are available to any and all of our citizens. As far as being discriminatory, some of the things that, like these applications for lower income services, the food stamps, the welfare, I can't get in this building without an ID. I can't rent a hotel room without an ID. I need an ID for so many other reasons besides voting that it would behoove everyone to get a photo ID. There's nothing more sacred in our country than the fair elections that we've talked about. In my mind, I wanted the best person to win my election. I wanted every vote to be counted. I wanted every vote to be fair, to be a registered person. We cannot put that at risk, where that's what we hold most valuable in our country, in our democracy, where we elect our leaders on a very fair, unregimented system. So I have a lot of issues with this bill. I do not think that it discriminates or does not allow for everyone and all of us to vote, and I respectfully ask that you vote against this bill.
For what purpose is Senator from Alexandria, Senator Eben, rise?
I got this. Mr. President, very briefly.
Senator has the floor.
In response to the junior senator from Virginia Beach's remarks, I don't know what it's like to be African American. I don't know what it's like to be African American and be born in a hospital in Virginia before people were allowed to be born or turned away, not having a birth certificate, which in turn leads to you getting an ID. Further, I don't know what it's like to live in a nursing home where your need for a utility bill or a driver's license, as was said, or anything else is needed on a daily basis. So while we may have photo IDs that are used on a daily basis, there are plenty of people who don't, and I don't want to make it hard for them to vote. So with that, I hope that we do pass the bill.
Do any other senators wish to be heard for the first time on this bill? Senior Senator from Fairfax, Senator Saslaw.
Mr. President, reference to the remarks you made by the senator from Franklin with respect to the dramatic increase in voters over the last 3 or 4 years. The only thing I can say to that is, unless you just arrived here from Mars, everybody in this room knows what has caused that dramatic jump in voters. Who are we kidding? And it sure wasn't this previous law that I hope that we get rid of today.
Senator from Hampton, Senator Locke.
Thank you, Mr. President. I renew my motion to pass Senate Bill 65.
Senator has the floor.
I do know what it's like to be an African American. And I certainly know what it's like to be under voting laws that repress the vote. When I registered to vote, I had to register under dual registration, which was designed to repress my vote as an African American. So, and I know why this bill was passed when it was passed in 2012. I know why it was passed. And there was a lag period for it to go into effect, because Shelby versus Holder was going before the Supreme Court. So it went into effect immediately following the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby versus Holder, which gutted. No, I'm not yielding.
Senator will not yield. Senator, has the floor.
It went into effect immediately following that Supreme Court ruling, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, which then said that states that were under the Voting Rights Act did not have to go to the Justice Department any longer to have their voting laws approved by the Justice Department. So what immediately goes into effect? Photo identification laws passed by Virginia for non-existent or limited fraud. And I have to correct my colleague from Arlington. It was less than 1/10 of 1%. Less than 1/10 of 1%. Any fraud is bad. Yes. But we're going to pass a repressive photo identification law. But we know what it was for. And we know why, Mr. President. So I went and looked up from the Heritage Foundation, certainly not a bastion of liberalism in its research, to see how many cases that had of voter fraud in Virginia that we've had since 2007, where there had been a conviction on voter fraud. Since 2007, there have been 17 convictions of voter fraud in Virginia. So we certainly have all of this rampant voter fraud going on in Virginia, so we certainly need photo ID to prevent that from happening. What I would like to see, Mr. President, is more people voting in Virginia, not less. I've heard, we've had all these people turning out since, 2008, 2012, all of these people turning out. Why don't we want more, rather than putting in place, in front of people, obstacles to voting, like this law? So I, again, move passage of Senate Bill 65.
Mr. President, I would ask if the gentlelady from Hampton would yield for a question.
Will the senator yield? Senator will not yield.
My question would have been, since she raised questions about the motives behind the passage, as the senator who proposed this bill, what she suspects was my motive that she seeks to indict. But since she will not yield, I will not put her on the spot to ask her what she is accusing me of.
Do any other senators wish to be heard regarding Senate Bill 65? Seeing none, the question is, shall Senate Bill 65 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 21, noes 19.
Ayes 21, noes 19. Senate Bill 65